7 in the morning. The kitchen still dark at the edges. A red and white ceramic pot sits plugged into the wall, humming so quietly you'd miss it under the sound of the coffee percolator. Someone browned meat in a skillet before the sun came up, dropped it in with onions and a can from the cupboard, and walked out the door to a job that didn't exist for her mother. 9 hours later, dinner would be ready without her standing over it. Nobody called this genius. It just got called Tuesday, number 25. Onion soup, mix pot roast chuck roast cost 89 cents a pound in 1975, the toughest, cheapest cut on the butcher's board, the one nobody fought over. A working mother in a suburban Midwest kitchen browned it fast in the morning, tore open a packet of dehydrated onions and beef flavoring, poured it over the meat with half a cup of water, and left for a shift that started at 8. 8 hours later, the roast fell apart at the touch of a fork, swimming in a dark, salty gravy that tasted like she'd spent all day on it. She hadn't. That was the point. Grandma just called it supper, number 24. Swiss steak round steak ran 99 cents a pound, cheap because it was tough, full of connective tissue that fought back against a fork. In small-town Midwest and Southern kitchens through the early 70s, a woman would take a metal mallet to it first, pounding flour into the fibers until her arm ached, then brown it and let it sit low and slow in tomatoes and onion until the toughness surrendered. The smell was sharp and metallic at first, then softened into something rich and almost sweet by evening. This was not a shortcut. This was an entire afternoon of quiet labor disguised as an easy dinner, and nobody ever thanked her for the part that happened before the pot went on. Number 23. Chicken and dumplings in the hollows of eastern Kentucky and the ridges of West Virginia. A whole fryer chicken cost around 45 cents a pound in the mid-1970s, and it was never just dinner. It was tomorrow's lunch, and the broth left behind was somebody's breakfast. The bird went in whole, simmering for hours until the meat slid off the bone on its own. Then came the dumplings. Flour, a little fat, a little water, dropped into the broth in soft pillows that swelled and turned glossy. Steam rose thick off the pot, smelling of chicken fat and black pepper. One bird fed a family of 6 for 2 days. That is not inefficiency. That is math the food industry has never wanted you to relearn. Number 22. Ham and bean soup in the steel towns outside Pittsburgh and Youngstown. Dried navy beans cost about 19 cents a pound. And this soup was never really a recipe. It was what happened to the ham bone after Easter or Christmas was over. Into the pot it went, along with the beans, an onion, maybe a bay leaf if the cupboard had one. 8 hours later, the broth had gone thick and cloudy, seasoned by marrow and fat that would otherwise have been thrown in the trash. The smell filled a row house from the porch to the attic. Nothing about this dish cost extra. Everything about it came from refusing to waste what most people today would call garbage. Number 21. Beef and barley soup German immigrant farm communities across Wisconsin and Minnesota built this one to stretch almost nothing into a week of dinners. A single pound of stew meat, browned dark, went into the pot with barley that cost about 12 cents a pound, and whatever root vegetables were sitting in the cellar. The barley swelled as it cooked, soaking up the beef fat until each spoonful carried more weight than the meat itself ever could. By evening, the kitchen smelled of something toasted and earthy, almost like bread. 1 pound of meat, 6 full bowls. Nobody in 1974 called that clever. They called it Tuesday, and they were right to. Number 20. Sauerbraten in the German-American neighborhoods of Cincinnati and St. Louis, this dish demanded something modern cooking has almost entirely abandoned: advance planning. A chuck roast, tough, cheap, unglamorous, went into a vinegar and spice marinade 3, sometimes 5 days before it ever touched heat, sitting in the cold of a cellar or an icebox, while the acid slowly broke the fibers down. By the time it finally hit the pot, it had already been transformed once. 8 more hours of low, slow simmering finished the job, and what came out was dark, sweet sour, almost tender enough to cut with a spoon. The ginger snap thickened gravy carried a bite that lingered on the tongue like nothing sold in a jar today. This was not a Tuesday night dish. This was a family's patience, planned out on a calendar a week in advance, just so Sunday dinner would taste like the old country. The women who made sauerbraten weren't improvising. They were following a recipe passed hand to hand across an ocean, adjusted for American cuts of meat and American grocery shelves, and never once written down in a cookbook that sold for money. Number 19. Kielbasa and sauerkraut on Pittsburgh's South Side and Chicago's Southeast Side. Kielbasa ran about 79 cents a pound in the mid-'70s. And this dinner existed for one reason: men coming home from mill shifts hungry, exhausted, and needing something ready the second they walked through the door. The kielbasa went in whole, sliced thick, layered over sauerkraut that had been fermenting in a crock of its own for weeks before it ever touched the stove. Caraway seed and a little brown sugar cut the sharp bite of the kraut into something rounder, deeper. By dinner time, the whole house smelled of smoke and vinegar and pork fat, a smell that clung to the wallpaper for days. This wasn't a fancy dish. It was built for men whose hands ached, by women whose hands ached just as much, in kitchens that never stopped running. Nobody wrote articles about how hard that was. They just set the table and did it again the next week. Number 18. Cabbage rolls, gołąbki. In the Polish and Ukrainian immigrant neighborhoods of Detroit and Chicago, cabbage cost about 10 cents a pound, and a single head of it could hide a pound of ground meat and rice, well enough to feed 8 people convincingly. The leaves were boiled soft, then wrapped by hand around a filling stretched thin with rice and onion, dozens of small green bundles packed tight into a pot and drowned in tomato sauce. Hours of low heat turned the cabbage translucent and sweet, the filling inside gone tender and rich. Assembling them took an entire afternoon of a grandmother's hands, folding the same motion over and over until the whole pot was full. This was not cabbage. This was meat, rationed and disguised, dressed up to look like more than it was, and somehow tasting like exactly enough. Here's what the food industry doesn't want you to know. In 1971, at the National Housewares Show in Chicago, a company called Rival unveiled a redesigned electric cooker in a shiny red shell and gave it a new name, the Crockpot. It retailed for $25. Rival aimed it squarely at a specific woman, the one now clocking in at an office or a factory floor who still came home expected to have dinner on the table by 6. Sales hit $2 million that first year. By 1975, they'd topped $93 million. The timing wasn't an accident. The 1973 oil embargo had every household in America anxious about energy, and Rival made sure everyone knew their little pot drew about as much electricity as a light bulb left on all day. Around the same time, Campbell's ran professionally trained home economists through test kitchens, whose entire job was engineering recipes built around their own condensed soups. Recipes designed to move product first, feed families second. The onion soup mix in that pot roast, the cream of mushroom in half these casseroles. That was not a grandmother's invention. That was a boardroom decision wearing an apron. Number 17. Chili con carne. On the cattle trails of Texas and the Southwest a century earlier, chili con carne found its way into crockpots nationwide by the mid-1970s, domesticated for suburban kitchens far from any chuck wagon. Chuck meat, cut small, ran about 89 cents a pound. Into the pot it went with chili powder, tomatoes, and beans if the family could afford to stretch it further. Some households could and did. Some considered beans a sacrilege, and that argument never really ended. 8 hours of slow heat let the meat break down until it barely needed chewing, the chili powder mellowing from sharp to smoky and deep. A single pot fed a family for 2 nights running, And the leftovers, some said, tasted even better the second day. That is not a coincidence. That is chemistry a Texas cook understood 100 years before anyone put it in a food science textbook. They knew things about slow heat that we will spend the next 50 years trying to remember. Here is the science underneath every dish on this list. Cheap, tough cuts of meat are loaded with collagen, the connective tissue that makes them chewy and unforgiving over a hot, fast flame. But held at a low temperature for 6, 8, 10 hours, that same collagen slowly breaks down and turns into gelatin, the very thing that makes a slow-cooked chuck roast taste richer, silkier, more satisfying than an expensive cut thrown on a grill. Modern nutrition science can chart this precisely now. Name the temperature ranges, graph the transformation. Immigrant grandmothers in Cleveland and Pittsburgh and rural Kentucky knew it as instinct, passed down without a single equation, because they'd watched it happen in a pot 1,000 times before. That is not progress. Replacing that instinct with a drive-through window. That is a specific, measurable loss, the loss of knowing what a cheap cut of meat could become if you simply gave it time instead of money. Number 16. Swedish meatballs in the Scandinavian American communities scattered across Minnesota. A blend of ground beef and pork ran close to 99 cents a pound combined, and this dish was built for one purpose: church potlucks, where a dish had to feed 20 people and still taste like somebody cared. The meatballs were rolled by hand, dozens of them, browned quickly before going into the pot to finish in a cream sauce thickened with flour and a touch of allspice that gave the whole dish its unmistakable warmth. The sauce turned pale and glossy after hours of slow cooking, clinging to each meatball like it had been poured on purpose rather than built from patience. Served over egg noodles, the whole dish tasted like a holiday even on an ordinary Wednesday. Women doubled and tripled this recipe without blinking, because in that community, food was never made for one family alone. It was made to be carried out the door in a covered dish and shared. Number 15. Chicken Paprikashin, Cleveland's Buckeye Woodland neighborhood. Home to one of the largest Hungarian communities in the country, paprika wasn't a spice rack afterthought. It was bought in bulk from a Hungarian grocer down the block, the good kind, deep red and fragrant. Nothing like the dusty tin most kitchens kept. A whole chicken, cut into pieces, browned, and then simmered for hours in a sauce built from that paprika. Onions cooked down until they nearly dissolved, and a generous ladle of sour cream stirred in near the end. The color alone told you something. A deep, burnt orange gravy that stained the noodles beneath it and clung to the back of a spoon. This was not simply chicken in sauce. This was a whole neighborhood's memory of a country most of them had never actually seen themselves, kept alive one dinner at a time, in a kitchen thousands of miles from where the recipe was born. Number 14. Beef stroganoff by the mid to late 70s, round steak at 99 cents a pound had found its way into a dish that let a factory town wife serve something that sounded like it belonged in Paris. Sliced thin, browned quickly, it simmered low with a packet of onion soup mix and a can of cream of mushroom, and near the very end, never before, or it would curdle. A generous dollop of sour cream folded in to finish the sauce pale and rich. Served over egg noodles, it looked, for one night, like something out of a magazine spread rather than a grocery budget. Dinner parties built entire evenings around this dish. Nobody at the table needed to know it started with the cheapest cut in the case. That was the quiet trick of it, turning almost nothing into something that felt like an occasion, and never once letting the guests see the seams. Number 13. Tater tot hottish in the church basements of Minnesota. Lutheran, Catholic, it didn't much matter which. Ground beef at around 79 cents a pound got browned, layered with a can of cream soup and a bag of frozen vegetables, and finished under a blanket of frozen tater tots that turned golden and crisp on top. By the end of the 70s, women reprogrammed it for the Crockpot, letting it run low and slow through an afternoon of errands and potluck prep. This dish was never really about the ingredients. It was the glue that held a whole community's Sunday together. The dish every family knew how to make. The dish that showed up at every funeral and every wedding and every ordinary potluck in between, filling the same long folding tables decade after decade. Grandma just called it hot dish. She never called it anything special, because to her it already was number 12. Beef bourguignon. By the mid-1970s, Julia Child had done something no cookbook before her had managed. She made a French peasant stew feel like something a suburban wife could attempt on a Tuesday. Chuck roast, still just 89 cents a pound, went into the pot browned dark, with a bottle of red wine, pearl onions, and mushrooms simmering low for the better part of a day. The kitchen filled with a smell nothing else on this list had. Wine reducing slowly into something almost sweet, beef fat rendering into a sauce so dark it looked black by the time it hit the plate. Served at a dinner party, it looked like it belonged in Burgundy. It was made in a $25 machine plugged into a kitchen outlet in Ohio. Nobody at that table needed to know the difference, and the woman who made it never once let on. Number 11. Round steak with mushroom gravy on farms across the rural Midwest. Round steak at 99 cents a pound and a 29-cent can of mushrooms were all it took to feed a table of 8 on a Sunday. The steak went in whole or cut into portions, browned quick in a skillet before the pot took over, simmering for hours in a gravy built from canned soup and the meat's own juices until it turned dark and glossy. There was no trip to a butcher counter for anything special here. No bone-in cut, no marbled ribeye. Just the cheapest steak in the case, transformed by nothing more than time and a closed lid. By the time the family sat down, the meat had gone so tender a fork did the work a knife used to. That is not a small trick. That is a family fed on almost nothing, and nobody at that table walking away hungry. Number 10. Corned beef and cabbage. In the Irish-American neighborhoods of Boston and New York, corned beef brisket ran about 99 cents a pound, salted and cured to stretch a tough cut across an entire pot of vegetables cooked in its own broth. Cabbage, carrots, and potatoes went in around the meat, soaking up the salt and fat as the brisket slowly gave up its toughness over hours of low heat. The smell was sharp at first. Brine and pepper, then rounded out into something warmer as the vegetables softened. One brisket, one pot, an entire family fed with vegetables that cost pennies, stretched into something that tasted like a holiday. This was not a corner cut. This was a whole dinner built around the cheapest piece of meat in the store, and it never once tasted like a compromise. Number 9. Salisbury steak. In working-class kitchens from coast to coast, ground beef at 79 cents a pound got shaped into oval patties, browned hard and fast, then dropped into the crock-pot to finish in a thick, dark onion gravy for hours. This was hamburger dressed up to feel like a real cut of meat, a trick as old as the Depression, revived for a decade that still couldn't afford to waste a pound of beef on a single dinner. The gravy thickened as it cooked, clinging to each patty until it looked, on the plate, almost like a cut of steak itself. Here's what the food industry doesn't want you to know. This was never a lesser meal. It was hamburger, stretched with onion and gravy and hours of patience, made to taste like something it never claimed to be, and nobody at that table complained. Number 8. Split pea soup with ham hock. Across Pennsylvania Dutch farm country and the small towns of New England, split peas cost about 15 cents a pound, and this soup existed for the same reason as half the dishes on this list. A ham hock nobody wanted to throw away. Into the pot it went with the peas, an onion, maybe a carrot, and 8 hours of low heat that turned everything thick, green, and rich with the marrow the bone had been holding on to. By evening the soup had gone dense enough to stand a spoon in, seasoned by nothing more than the bone itself. A ham hock most people today would consider garbage built an entire dinner for a family of 5. That is not desperation. That is knowing exactly what a bone is worth. Here's what the food industry doesn't want you to know. In 1953, Swanson found itself sitting on 200 tons of unsold frozen Thanksgiving turkey and solved the problem by inventing something new. A foil tray divided into compartments, heated in 30 minutes, requiring nothing from anyone. They called it the TV dinner, and it launched an entire industry of frozen food that would dominate American grocery aisles clear through the 1970s. By the decade this list belongs to, Swanson had leaned into the pitch hard, marketing oversized hungry man dinners straight at men living on their own, with football players serving each other frozen trays in television commercials. 2 machines, 1 decade, 2 completely different promises. A Crockpot said, "Your labor still matters. We'll just make it fit your schedule." A frozen dinner said, "Skip the labor entirely. We'll sell it back to you already finished." One of those companies got rich convincing a generation that cooking wasn't worth their time. That is not progress. That is a mother's effort, quietly rebranded as something obsolete. Number 7. Scalloped potatoes and Hammond, Pennsylvania Dutch and Amish farm country, potatoes cost about 10 cents a pound, and leftover ham from a Sunday dinner rarely went to waste twice. The potatoes were sliced thin, layered by hand into the pot with the ham, and a cream sauce built from milk and a little flour, dozens of rounds stacked one after another until the pot was full. Hours of slow heat let the layers soften into something that held its shape but yielded easily to a fork, each bite carrying cream, salt, and the smoky edge of the ham beneath it. This was not a fast dish. Layering those potatoes took real time, real patience, a woman's hands working through an afternoon so that dinner would taste by evening like it had cost far more than it did. Number 6. Beef and vegetable soup, Mulligan stew, in railroad towns and factory neighborhoods, still carrying habits from the Depression 2 generations earlier. This stew had no fixed recipe, only a fixed rule. Whatever sat in the icebox went in the pot. A scrap of stew meat, the end of a bag of carrots, a few potatoes going soft, a can of tomatoes if there was one. Hours of low heat blurred it all into something thick and dark, the kind of stew that tasted slightly different every single time it was made, and somehow always tasted like home. Nothing about this dish had a name that stayed the same from house to house. Some called it Mulligan stew. Some just called it soup. Grandma just called it not wasting good food. She was right. Everything she knew was right. Number 5. Minnesota chow mein hot dishin' Lutheran church basements across Minnesota. Ground beef at 79 cents a pound met a can of chow mein noodles and a can of cream of mushroom soup, built into a hot dish that a Midwestern kitchen considered downright exotic. Celery and onion went in for crunch, the noodles softening at the edges while staying crisp enough on top to give the dish its texture. This was not authentic to anyone's grandmother in Guangzhou. This was America's idea of adventure, filtered through a grocery store in St. Paul and a crock-pot set on low for 6 hours. Today we'd call the whole premise almost funny. In 1974, it was the boldest thing on the potluck table, and every dish came back to the church kitchen scraped clean. Number 4. Pepper steak. By the mid-1970s, suburban kitchens across the country were taking their best guess at Chinese-American restaurant food, and pepper steak became the weeknight answer. Round steak, sliced thin against the grain at 99 cents a pound, went into the pot with green peppers, onion, and a sauce, built from soy sauce and a little sugar, simmering for hours until the beef turned tender enough to eat without much chewing. This was a family's one attempt each week at something that felt foreign, assembled entirely from what the grocery store down the street actually stocked. It never tasted like a restaurant. It tasted like effort. A woman trying to bring something new to a table that mostly saw the same 6 dinners on rotation, and succeeding at it more often than she probably gave herself credit for. They knew things about time that we will spend the next 50 years trying to remember. None of this labor ever showed up on a paycheck. A woman browning meat before sunrise, timing a pot's cook time around a bus schedule, feeding a family of 6 on 80 cents a pound of chuck. That was calculus. Real, daily, unforgiving calculus, done in her head, without a spreadsheet, without a raise, without so much as a thank you most nights. The economy never counted it as work because it happened inside a house instead of a factory. That is not nostalgia talking. That is a debt, and nobody ever repaid it. Number 3. Barbecue beef, chuck sandwiches across Midwest and Southern kitchens by the late 1970s, a chuck roast at 89 cents a pound went into the pot with little more than ketchup, vinegar, and brown sugar, left to fall apart over 8 hours until a fork could shred it without resistance. Piled onto white bread, it needed no plate, no ceremony, no real cleanup. Just bread and a fork if a family was feeling formal that night. This was a Friday dinner built for exhaustion, for a week that had already asked enough of everyone in that house. Today we call this pulled beef and charge $14 a sandwich at a food truck. Nobody's improved the recipe. They've just found a way to sell it back to us at 100 times the cost of the chuck roast that started it. Number 2. Chicken cacciatore in the Italian-American neighborhoods of Boston's North End and Chicago. A whole cut-up chicken at about 45 cents a pound became a hunter's stew carried across an ocean and rebuilt with an American grocery store bird. Tomatoes, peppers, and onions simmered around the chicken for hours, the sauce thickening into something deep red and fragrant with garlic and oregano, the smell filling a whole building's stairwell by dinner time. This was not fine dining. It was a recipe someone's grandmother remembered from a country most of the family had never seen, remade with whatever the American butcher had on sale that week. Nothing about it was diminished by the substitution. It still tasted, somehow, exactly like where it came from. Number 1. Old-fashioned beef stew. No region owns this one. No decade owns it either. It existed before crockpots, and it'll exist after every trend that follows them is forgotten. Stew meat at 89 cents a pound, carrots, potatoes, an onion, whatever was left in the vegetable bin, all of it simmering for hours until the broth turned dark and the meat gave way without a fight. There is nothing remarkable about this dish, and that is exactly why it closes this list. Before it was a recipe anyone wrote down, it was simply what a family ate when there wasn't much money, and there was somehow still dinner on the table every single night. That was never poverty. That was a promise kept over and over in a pot that never once ran empty. Closing braise it, marinate it, wrap it by hand in a cabbage leaf, and fold it closed. That's what these women did. Not because a magazine told them to, not because a machine did the thinking for them, but because they understood a cheap cut of meat better than most professional kitchens do today. They were not behind the times. They were ahead of a science that hadn't caught up to them yet. A woman in a Cleveland kitchen, simmering paprikash for 4 hours, knew exactly what she was doing to that chicken, even if nobody had ever explained collagen to her. She was right. Everything she knew was right. And somewhere along the way, a handful of companies figured out how to sell that instinct back to us in a can, a packet, a plastic tub, dressed up as convenience, priced far higher than the 12 cents a pound barley ever cost. That is not innovation. That is a family's hard-won knowledge, repackaged and sold back to their grandchildren at a markup nobody asked for. Comment below and tell me which one your grandmother made.